In the sun-drenched, windswept plains of New Mexico, a quiet cowboy named Jake Holbrook has lived most of his life in solitude. As a cattleman, he's known for his hard work and quiet demeanor. But when a band of ruthless bandits rolls into town, eager to make trouble, they make the mistake of mocking him, unaware that Jake is no ordinary cowboy. With a legendary reputation for the fastest draw in the West, Jake is forced to confront these outlaws in a showdown that will test the limits of courage, skill, and survival. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. The sun hung low over the desert, casting long shadows over the small town of Red Bluff. Nestled along the Pecos River, the town had never been much more than a trading post for travelers crossing the dry, vast stretch of land between Texas and New Mexico. There were no grand saloons or bustling businesses, just a few homes, a general store, and a stable where local ranchers would bring their cattle in for sale or trade. In the late afternoons, the wind would pick up, swirling dust across the dirt streets, leaving the town feeling like a forgotten speck on a map. But for Jake Holbrook, Red Bluff had always felt like home. He'd settled here years ago, drawn by the open land, the quiet life, and the promise of peace. Most of the folks around town didn't ask too many questions about Jake's past. He was just another rancher, keeping to himself, working hard, and staying out of trouble. But Jake Holbrook was no ordinary cowboy. He had a reputation, though it wasn't one he shared with the good folks of Red Bluff. Jake had earned his fame in ways he would rather forget. He had been part of a much larger, much wilder world. A world where men fought fast and dirty, where a single mistake could cost you everything. But that was all behind him now. He preferred to keep to himself, quiet and out of sight. Still, there were moments when the old life came creeping back, and Jake knew it wouldn't be long before trouble came looking for him. Jake had just finished a long day's work, his hands caked in the dust of the trail, his body aching from hours in the saddle. He stood in the doorway of his cabin, gazing out across the rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon. The sun was setting, and the sky had taken on a warm, amber hue, casting a glow over the landscape that felt almost peaceful. But Jake knew better. As he reached for his hat, he heard the sound of horses in the distance, their hooves kicking up dust. It wasn't uncommon for riders to pass through Red Bluff, but something about the way they approached made Jake uneasy. He'd been living in this part of the country long enough to recognize the signs of trouble, and he could feel it in his gut. He tipped his hat back, wiping the sweat from his brow, and waited. The riders came into view, kicking up a cloud of dust as they made their way toward the town. There were 4 of them, all wearing dark coats and wide-brimmed hats that shielded their faces from the sun. They were a rough-looking bunch, their horses sweaty from the ride and their saddles heavy with gear. Jake didn't move, standing there in the doorway of his cabin, watching them approach. He knew better than to make a scene, but he also knew that trouble had a way of finding him. The riders came to a stop in front of the general store, their horses snorting and pawing at the dirt. One of them, a tall, wiry man with a scar across his cheek, dismounted and walked into the store. The others stayed outside, leaning against their horses, talking in low voices. Jake stayed where he was, still watching from a distance, waiting to see what these men wanted. His instincts told him this wasn't just a group of travelers stopping for a drink or a meal. They had a purpose, and Jake had a feeling it wasn't going to be a pleasant one. He was about to turn back to his cabin when he heard the sound of laughter. It was loud, brash, and full of the kind of arrogance Jake had seen in men who thought they could take anything they wanted. He looked back toward the group of riders and saw that one of them, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache, had stepped forward. He was talking to one of the locals, a young ranch hand who worked at the store. The ranch hand was barely out of his teens, still wet behind the ears, but it didn't seem to matter to the bandit. The bandit was laughing, a cruel, mocking laugh that carried across the street. He pointed a finger at the ranch hand, then at Jake, who was still standing in the doorway of his cabin. "Look at this guy," the bandit shouted. "Just another lonely cowboy, probably doesn't even know how to use a real gun." Jake's hand instinctively brushed the worn grip of his Colt .45, though he didn't move from his spot. The bandit's words weren't meant for him, but something about the way the man said it set Jake's teeth on edge. He had been ridiculed before, but never in a way that felt so deliberate. The young ranch hand, obviously embarrassed, laughed nervously, trying to avoid eye contact with Jake. He was too young to know what kind of trouble the man was bringing down on him. Jake's eyes narrowed. This wasn't the first time a bandit or two had come through Red Bluff, but something about this group didn't sit right with him. They were pushing their luck, and Jake wasn't in the mood to let them get away with it. The man who had mocked him was still laughing, turning back to the group with a smug grin on his face. "Maybe we ought to make a little wager," he called out to his friends. "See if this cowboy can even pull his gun fast enough to make a difference." The others joined in with mocking laughter, all of them looking over at Jake. They thought it was a joke, a way to amuse themselves in this backwater town. But Jake wasn't laughing. His hand had tightened around the grip of his revolver. His calm exterior hid the storm raging inside him. He wasn't the man they thought he was. He had learned long ago that some battles were won in an instant. The speed of your hand, the accuracy of your aim. It all mattered when you were staring down the barrel of a gun. The man with the scar on his cheek walked out of the general store, wiping his hands on his pants. He caught the tail end of the laughter and glanced toward Jake. Well, what do we have here?" he said, his voice laced with a casual menace. "The quiet cowboy who thinks he's something special. You think you're fast, huh?" Jake didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just stepped forward, his boots making a soft thud against the porch as he moved into the street, his eyes never leaving the bandit. "You've made a mistake," Jake said, his voice low, steady. "I'm not the kind of man you want to test." The bandits all stopped laughing. The air between them seemed to thicken, the tension rising with every second. Jake's hand hovered just above the grip of his revolver, his fingers flexing around it. He wasn't going to be mocked. Not like this. The air between Jake and the bandits grew thick with tension, heavy with the promise of something inevitable. For a moment, everything was still, too still. The horses pawed at the dirt, their hooves scraping against the hard ground. But the men didn't move. The laughter had died, replaced by an unsettling silence that stretched between Jake and the four bandits. The man with the scarred face stepped forward, a twisted grin forming on his lips as he locked eyes with Jake. "What's the matter, cowboy? Got something to prove?" He had seen the subtle movement of Jake's hand toward his revolver, and it had only fueled his arrogance. He thought he had the upper hand, thought Jake was just another man with a reputation. He didn't realize that sometimes reputation was built with the barrel of a gun, not words. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Jake said, his voice calm, barely a whisper above the wind. He wasn't interested in showing off, but he wasn't going to be humiliated either. The words stung, more than he cared to admit. They struck at something buried deep inside him, something he had tried to bury in the past. The scarred man laughed again, but this time, it wasn't as sure of itself. He glanced back at the other men, trying to gauge their reaction, but all of them were still watching Jake with the kind of interest you reserve for a snake. Cautious, wary, waiting to see what it would do next. "You think you can draw faster than me, old man?" the scarred man asked, his voice now tinged with mockery. "We'll see about that." Jake didn't answer. He just stood there, his legs planted firmly, his hands at his sides, the tension in the air palpable. He could hear the other bandits shifting behind him, waiting for the signal, the movement that would tell them whether this was about to turn into a shootout. "All right, here's the deal," the scarred man continued, his voice louder now, more sure of himself. "You and me. A quick draw. No tricks, just a clean fight." The other bandits laughed, clearly entertained by the idea of a showdown. They were outnumbering Jake, and they thought they had the advantage. They didn't realize that Jake wasn't a man who fought for sport. He fought to win, to survive. Jake's fingers twitched slightly on his right hand, brushing against the familiar grip of his revolver. He felt the weight of it, the cold steel that had been with him through too many fights to count. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. His draw was faster than anyone knew, but speed wasn't the only thing that mattered. It was precision, and Jake had spent years honing both. "You're making a mistake," Jake said, his voice low. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, one that was meant to save the scarred man's life, even if he didn't realize it. The scarred man's eyes narrowed. He was used to being the one to make others back down, not the other way around. His hand moved slowly toward his gun, a deliberate gesture, as if he were testing Jake's resolve. Jake stood still, his eyes locked on the man's movements. He could feel the tension in the air as if it were a living thing. The wind had died down, and everything seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the scarred man's hand shot to his revolver. It was fast, but Jake's eyes were faster. His hand was already on the grip of his Colt .45, his thumb working the hammer back with the kind of speed only a man who had spent a lifetime in gunfights could manage. The gunshot rang out like a thunderclap, but it wasn't the scarred man's bullet that hit. Jake's shot was first. The scarred man's hand jerked backward, his revolver spinning from his grasp as the bullet hit him square in the shoulder. He dropped to the ground with a grunt, his eyes wide in disbelief. He hadn't even seen it coming. The other bandits froze, their hands twitching near their holsters, but Jake didn't move. He didn't have to. The speed of his draw had already settled the matter. "Anyone else?" Jake asked, his voice calm, but with a cold edge that made it clear he wasn't playing games. His eyes swept over the 3 remaining bandits, who were now eyeing each other with uncertainty. They hadn't expected Jake to be that fast. The bandits didn't speak. They didn't have to. The silence between them said it all. They had heard the stories, the whispers of a cowboy who could shoot faster than anyone else, but they hadn't believed it. Now, they knew the truth. The scarred man groaned on the ground, clutching his shoulder, blood soaking through his shirt. He looked up at Jake, eyes full of fear and anger. You shot me." Jake stepped forward slowly, his boots crunching on the dirt, his revolver still held loosely in his hand. He didn't need to do anything more. His reputation was already made. The bandits knew who he was now, and they knew they wouldn't win. "Get up," Jake said, his voice firm. "Get out of here, and take your friends with you." The remaining bandits hesitated, their hands hovering near their guns, but none of them made a move. They knew they were outmatched. There was no honor in trying to kill a man who had already proved himself faster and smarter than they were. After a long, tense moment, one of the bandits, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scruffy beard, finally spoke. "Let's go," he said gruffly, his voice laced with irritation and fear. "This ain't worth it." Without another word, the 3 remaining men mounted their horses and rode off, kicking up dust behind them. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. They knew they weren't welcome in Red Bluff anymore. They had learned their lesson the hard way. Jake watched them disappear into the distance, his hand still resting lightly on the grip of his revolver. The sound of their hooves faded, and the air seemed to settle again. The people in Red Bluff, who had been watching from the windows and doorways, slowly began to relax, their fearful gazes softening as they realized the danger had passed. Jake turned toward the saloon, his heart steady and calm despite the rush of adrenaline that still lingered in his chest. He wasn't looking for praise. He wasn't even looking for recognition. He just wanted the peace he'd fought for all these years. He'd won this round, but Jake knew it wasn't over. The world had a way of testing men like him, and there was always more trouble around the corner. But for now, Red Bluff was safe. For now, that was enough. The dust hadn't settled in Red Bluff, but the air was quieter now, as if the town itself was taking a collective breath. The last echoes of the bandits' departure were still hanging in the wind, and Jake Holbrook stood in the street, his gun still in his hand, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of more trouble. The people in town began to emerge from their hiding places, peeking out from behind doors and windows, hesitant but curious, unsure of what had just transpired. Jake holstered his revolver and turned slowly, walking toward the saloon, where the tension that had filled the air was starting to dissipate. He didn't look for recognition. He didn't need anyone to tell him he'd done the right thing. But it was clear that word of his swift draw had already begun to spread. He could hear whispers, muffled voices from inside the saloon, though no one dared approach him just yet. They were still processing what they had seen. The door to the saloon opened slowly, and Tom, the bartender, stepped out, his face full of both admiration and trepidation. He had seen Jake ride into town many times over the years, But today was different. There had been something about the way Jake had handled the situation that left Tom in awe. "Jake," Tom said, his voice low and cautious, as if unsure whether to praise or question the man standing in front of him. That was something else. Jake didn't look up at him immediately, his gaze still fixed on the empty street ahead. He had heard the tension in Tom's voice. It wasn't just surprise. It was fear, too. "Don't make too much of it, Tom," Jake said, his voice calm, almost detached. He wasn't looking for attention. "Not today. I'm just a cowboy, same as any other." Those men got what they deserved. Tom stepped a little closer, his boots scraping against the dust. Those men, they weren't just some drifters passing through. You saw the way they moved. You know who they were, don't you? Jake nodded slowly, the weight of the question settling in. He knew exactly who they were. The scarred man, the one who had mocked him. He was part of a larger gang that had been making their way across New Mexico, leaving a trail of violence and robbery behind them. They had a reputation for terrorizing small towns and cattle ranches, taking what they wanted and killing anyone who resisted. They had made the mistake of underestimating Jake, thinking he was just another quiet cowboy without a past. But Jake had made it a point to leave that past behind. He had left the fast-drawing, gunslinging world behind. He'd chosen this quiet life, working the forge, building his cattle business. But no one ever truly escaped their past. It always found its way back. "I know who they were," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But it doesn't matter now. They won't be coming back." Tom watched him for a moment, as if weighing his words. Then he nodded, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Guess we owe you one, Jake. The town owes you." Jake didn't respond immediately. He walked into the saloon, his boots heavy against the wood floor. The few remaining patrons had gathered near the back, muttering among themselves, their eyes flicking toward Jake as he entered. Some of them were the same ranchers who had been at the store earlier, the ones who had seen the bandits mock him. Now, they looked at him with a mixture of respect and awe, though none of them spoke up. Jake didn't need their praise. He didn't want it. He took a seat at the bar, his fingers curling around the glass Tom set in front of him. A shot of whiskey. Strong. Just what he needed to calm his nerves. "Want to talk about it?" Tom asked, his voice hesitant. "About who you really are, I mean." Jake sighed and leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing for a moment. He wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. He had worked too hard to bury that part of his life, to escape it. But in a town like Red Bluff, a man couldn't hide forever. He knew the stories would start circulating. The whispers about the quiet cowboy who could shoot faster than anyone. "I don't talk about it, Tom," Jake said, his voice low. "It's not a story worth telling. Not anymore." Tom didn't press the issue. He had seen men like Jake before. The ones who carried their pasts like chains around their necks, unwilling to let go but knowing that they had to in order to survive. Tom knew that Jake had his reasons. They all did. Outside, the wind howled again, picking up the dust and sending it swirling around the town. The quiet had returned, but Jake knew it wouldn't last. The bandits had been a warning. They had come looking for trouble, and Jake had given it to them. But there was something bigger on the horizon. Something darker. He could feel it in the air. Tom went back to his duties behind the bar, pouring drinks and exchanging quick words with the locals. But Jake didn't notice. He was lost in his thoughts, staring out the saloon window at the empty street. He was waiting for something. He wasn't sure what, but he could feel it coming, just over the ridge. The door to the saloon opened again, and this time, Jake didn't have to look up to know who it was. There was a heavy silence that entered with the man, an unspoken tension that filled the room. Jake didn't have to ask. He could feel it in his bones. The man who entered was tall, his figure outlined by the sun setting behind him. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face, but Jake could see enough. The tall figure's boots scraped against the floorboards as he walked toward the bar. He wasn't just any stranger. Jake had seen him before. The man stepped into the saloon, his boots making a heavy, deliberate thud against the floorboards. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a worn, faded brown duster that trailed behind him like a shadow. His wide-brimmed hat obscured most of his face, but Jake could see the familiar outline of a scar running down the left side of his neck, a mark from a gunfight long past. Jake's grip on his glass tightened just slightly, but he didn't flinch. He had seen this man before, in a dozen different towns, in a dozen different circumstances. His name was Sam O'Rourke, and he wasn't just any stranger. He was a part of Jake's past, a part that Jake had hoped to never face again. Sam O'Rourke had a reputation of his own, one that ran just as deep as Jake's. They had crossed paths once or twice, both men playing on opposite sides of the law. Sam was a bounty hunter, known for tracking down the most elusive and dangerous criminals in the West. His eyes, cold and calculating, were sharp enough to pick out a man from miles away. And when Sam set his sights on someone, there was no escaping. As Sam approached the bar, the entire saloon seemed to quiet. The ranchers, the regulars, the travelers, they all paused, some standing still, some glancing at each other nervously. Tom, the bartender, set down the glass he was polishing and stepped back, his expression wary but respectful. He didn't know what kind of trouble Sam was bringing to Red Bluff, but he knew enough not to ask. Sam pulled up a stool at the bar, his gaze flicking to Jake, who remained seated, his hands still resting on the whiskey glass. The air seemed to thicken between them, the weight of unspoken history hanging in the balance. For a moment, neither man said anything. The tension was palpable, filling the room with a heaviness that made everyone uneasy. It wasn't just the fact that Sam O'Rourke was in town. It was what he represented. The past. A past that Jake had tried to bury, but a past that Sam knew too well. Sam finally spoke, his voice low, gravelly, but with a trace of something like familiarity underneath. "Jake Holbrook," he said, as though testing the name on his tongue. "I thought I might find you here." Jake didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a slow sip from his glass, his eyes never leaving Sam's face. He knew what Sam was here for. He always did. "You're a long way from wherever it is you call home, Sam," Jake said finally, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "What brings you to Red Bluff?" Sam's lips twitched upward, but it wasn't a smile. It was a calculated grin, the kind that came from a man who had seen too much, done too much, and was comfortable in that skin. "Just passing through, Jake. Just passing through." Jake could hear the lie in his voice, thick as the dust that had settled over the town. Sam wasn't just passing through. He never was. Jake had been the target of enough bounty hunters over the years to know when one of them had a particular interest in someone. Sam wasn't just passing through Red Bluff. He was here for a reason. "What do you want, Sam?" Jake asked, his voice even but firm. "You don't come into a town like this without a reason." Sam leaned in closer, his elbows resting on the bar, and his voice dropped even lower. "I'm looking for a man," he said, his eyes scanning Jake's face, as if trying to gauge his reaction. "And I think I've found him." Jake didn't flinch. He had been expecting this, but it didn't make it any easier. "I'm not your man," Jake replied simply, not breaking his gaze. "And I don't know who you're looking for, but it's not me." Sam's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something between them, something that neither man wanted to acknowledge. It was a connection forged in the heat of past gunfights, a connection that neither of them had ever fully walked away from. "You're still the fastest draw in the West, aren't you, Jake?" Sam asked, his voice quiet but full of menace. "I've heard the stories. Fast hands, a quick trigger. You've made quite a name for yourself over the years." Jake didn't answer. He wasn't interested in discussing old stories, stories that had earned him a reputation that followed him wherever he went. He wasn't that man anymore. He didn't want to be that man. "I've got no business with you, Sam," Jake said, his voice hardening, his fingers tightening around the glass. "So why don't you turn around, walk out that door, and leave this town in peace?" Sam didn't seem to take offense, but there was a glimmer of something else in his eyes, something calculating, something dangerous. "You think I'm here to make peace, Jake? You're a lot more naive than I thought. I'm here because there's money to be made." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had been prepared for this, but hearing it out loud made it real. Sam wasn't after him for old grudges or unfinished business. Sam O'Rourke had come to Red Bluff for one thing: money, and Jake knew what that meant. The bounty hunters were coming for him again. "I've got nothing to offer you, Sam," Jake said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension rolling through his body. "Nothing worth your time." Sam chuckled darkly, leaning back in his stool. "You're wrong, Jake. You've got plenty to offer. You've got a price on your head, and I'm here to collect." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He had hoped to escape the past, to live a quiet life. But it seemed that the past wasn't done with him. And this time, it wasn't just a gang of outlaws. It was Sam O'Rourke, the one man who could track him down in the dead of night and make sure he paid the price for what he had done. Jake didn't want to go down this road again. He had left that life behind, but he knew it didn't matter. There was no escaping the past. "Not now. Are you going to kill me, Sam?" Jake asked, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. Sam's smile faded, his gaze cold and unreadable. "I'm not here to kill you, Jake," he said, his voice low. "But if you don't come with me, I'll make sure you never draw again." Jake's hand drifted toward his revolver, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. The room was still, the sound of the wind outside filling the silence. He didn't know how this was going to end, but one thing was clear. There was no walking away this time. Jake sat still, his fingers brushing against the worn grip of his Colt .45. His hand relaxed, but every muscle in his body was tense. The weight of Sam O'Rourke's words hung heavy in the air, each syllable like a bullet lodged deep inside Jake's chest. It wasn't the threat of death that bothered him. It was the reminder of everything he had left behind, everything he had worked so hard to bury. Sam O'Rourke was no fool. He knew exactly how to handle a man like Jake. He had come with a purpose, to remind Jake of who he was, of the gunfighter he used to be. And now, here they were, two men facing off in a dusty little town, both unwilling to back down. For a long moment, the room stayed quiet. The wind howled outside, its eerie wail almost as though it, too, was waiting for something to happen. The other patrons of the saloon kept their distance, none of them daring to make a sound. They all knew Sam O'Rourke's reputation, and they knew what he was capable of. But none of them had the courage to intervene. Finally, it was Jake who broke the silence. "You really think I'm just going to walk out of here with you, Sam?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "I've lived a quiet life here, far from all that trouble, and you think I'll just throw it all away?" Sam's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I don't think you've got much of a choice, Jake. Not anymore. They'll come for you either way. You can run, but eventually they'll catch up with you. And when they do, it won't be me pulling the trigger." Jake's jaw clenched, and he looked away for a brief moment, staring out the window at the open plain beyond. It was true. The past had a way of catching up with a man, no matter how far he tried to run. But Jake had been living in that shadow for too long. He wasn't afraid of it anymore. "I'm not going with you," Jake said flatly, his voice gaining strength. "Not without a damn good reason." Sam's eyes flashed with a mixture of amusement and frustration. "You think I'm giving you a choice, Jake? I've got my orders, and I'm here to collect. You're not going to leave this town until I say so." The tension in the room thickened. Jake's hand twitched at his side, itching to draw, but he held himself back. The saloon was crowded, and though he was confident in his speed, he wasn't about to make a move unless he had no other choice. Sam wasn't just any bounty hunter. He was a man who knew how to survive. He had killed before, and he wasn't afraid to do it again. "What makes you think I'm going to make this easy for you, Sam?" Jake asked, his voice dropping lower, filled with the kind of cold determination that only came from years of living in a world where a man's life could change in a heartbeat. Sam laughed, a low, mocking sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You don't get it, Jake. You're a legend. People know who you are, what you've done. You can run, hide, and pretend to be a quiet cowboy, but you can't escape the fact that you're dangerous. You've killed more men than I care to count." Jake clenched his fist around the whiskey glass, the sharp edge of the glass biting into his palm, but he didn't flinch. "I didn't kill for sport, Sam," he said through gritted teeth. "I didn't kill for fun. I did what I had to do to survive. You can't understand that." Sam leaned closer, his face inches from Jake's. The smell of tobacco and sweat filled the air, and Jake could feel the heat of the man's breath. I understand it just fine, but that doesn't change anything. The world you left behind is still out there, and it's come looking for you." Jake took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't afraid of Sam. He wasn't even afraid of death. But he had worked hard for this life, for the peace that he had earned. He wasn't going to let it all slip away because of some bounty. With a sudden, sharp movement, Sam stood up and turned to face the door. "You've got until tomorrow, Jake," he said, his voice cold and final. "I don't want to make this harder than it has to be, but if you don't come with me, I'll make sure you regret it." Jake's eyes followed Sam's every movement, watching him closely as he headed for the door. The sound of Sam's boots on the wooden floorboards echoed in the silence. As Sam reached for the door handle, he paused and glanced over his shoulder. "You're making a big mistake, Jake," Sam said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've got more enemies than you know. The past never stays buried. It always finds a way to come back." Jake didn't reply. He just sat there, his thoughts racing. He could hear the soft clinking of glasses in the background, the shuffle of feet, but it all felt distant. He wasn't thinking about the people in the saloon. He wasn't even thinking about the past. He was thinking about what came next. He couldn't let Sam win. He couldn't let himself be dragged back into a life he had left behind. As Sam stepped outside, Jake turned toward the door, his mind made up. The night was still young, but Jake knew that in the morning, things were going to change. Sam O'Rourke wasn't going to leave him in peace. He was going to force him back into the world Jake had fought so hard to escape. Jake stood, his body moving with a quiet, deadly purpose, and walked out of the saloon. He knew the stakes. He knew the cost, and he was ready. Jake Holbrook stood in the street, the fading light of day casting long shadows across the town of Red Bluff. He hadn't gone far. He didn't need to. His hand rested lightly on the grip of his revolver, his fingers brushing the cold steel as the chill of the evening settled over him. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few ranchers finishing their work for the day. But Jake didn't need to worry about them. They had all seen enough to know when to mind their own business. He hadn't expected Sam to come this far, hadn't expected him to track him down in a place like this. Red Bluff was supposed to be a haven, a quiet town where the past stayed buried. But the world had a way of dragging you back in, no matter how hard you tried to leave it behind. As the wind howled through the empty street, Jake turned toward the general store. He needed supplies, things to prepare for what was coming. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Sam O'Rourke wasn't the kind of man to let things slide, and Jake knew that if he wanted to survive, he'd have to make his move first. The door of the general store creaked open as Jake stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled softly, and the old shopkeeper, a gray-haired man named Earl, looked up from behind the counter. Earl had seen his fair share of travelers come through Red Bluff, but he'd never seen a man like Jake. And now, with trouble brewing in town, Earl had a feeling he wasn't going to like what was coming next. "You need something, Jake?" Earl asked, his voice raspy from years of living in the dry desert air. Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the shelves. He wasn't looking for much, just the basics. Ammo, a few provisions for the road. But his mind wasn't on the supplies. It was on Sam and what he was planning to do. "I need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice low. "But I can't leave just yet. Got some business to take care of." Earl didn't ask any more questions. He knew better than to pry into Jake's affairs. The old man had seen enough men come and go through Red Bluff to know that some things were better left unsaid. As Jake gathered what he needed, the quiet in the store was almost oppressive. Every sound felt amplified, the rustle of paper, the soft click of the cash register. Earl moved around behind the counter, his steps slow and deliberate. He knew trouble was on the horizon, and the last thing Jake needed was any more attention from the wrong people. Jake paid for the supplies in silence, the tension between them hanging in the air. When he turned to leave, Earl called out to him, his voice filled with a mixture of concern and resignation. "Jake," Earl said softly, his eyes looking past Jake, out the window toward the horizon. "You're not going to make it out of here. You know that, right?" Jake didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew what Earl was getting at. But Jake had already made his decision. He had walked away from the life of a gunfighter long ago, But that didn't mean he could ignore the call when it came. "I'll take my chances," Jake replied, his voice steady and sure. "I've been on this road before." He stepped out of the store and into the street, the last remnants of daylight disappearing behind the hills. The wind still blew, strong and relentless, as if urging him onward. He didn't know how this was going to end, but he did know one thing. It wasn't going to be easy. As Jake made his way back toward his cabin, the weight of his past pressed down on him. He had been running for years, hiding behind a quiet life. But the truth was that he had always known this day would come. Sam O'Rourke was just the first to remind him of that. Jake didn't stop at his cabin. He didn't have time to go over old memories or second-guess his decisions. He had a showdown coming, and he needed to be ready. The man who had come for him was relentless, a hunter of men who had made his living by tracking down those who thought they could outrun their past. The moon was high in the sky as Jake reached the edge of town. He didn't look back. He wasn't going to let Sam find him unprepared. He walked toward the ridge just outside Red Bluff, a place where the landscape opened up and the horizon stretched for miles. It was the perfect place for a final showdown, a place where there would be no distractions, no bystanders, and no escape. The wind howled again, stronger this time, carrying the scent of dust and rain from the distant mountains. Jake's heart beat steady in his chest, the rhythm of his breath even. This wasn't a fight he wanted, but it was one he couldn't avoid. He had lived his life by a code, and part of that code was facing whatever came his way without hesitation. As Jake made his way to the ridge, he spotted the familiar outline of Sam's silhouette standing at the edge of the hill. He hadn't expected Sam to wait for him, but the man was a professional. He wouldn't let Jake get away. Sam turned when he saw Jake, his hand resting casually on the grip of his revolver. His eyes narrowed as he studied Jake, sizing him up one last time. "You should have left, Jake," Sam said, his voice low and steady, the wind carrying his words to Jake. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Jake didn't respond. His hand hovered near his revolver, his fingers brushing against the cold leather of his holster. The wind whipped through his coat, the air growing colder with each passing second. He didn't know if this was the end of the road for him, but he wasn't about to let Sam take him down without a fight. "Let's get this over with," Jake said finally, his voice calm, but with a hard edge. "You've got your gun. I've got mine." The two men stood there, facing each other in the cold night air, the tension thick enough to choke on. In a town like Red Bluff, there were no rules. There was only the draw, the shot, and who was left standing. Jake didn't know how this was going to end, but he was ready to find out. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale glow over the barren hills that stretched out around Red Bluff. The wind had picked up again, howling through the dry earth and kicking up small clouds of dust. Jake Holbrook stood, his boots firm on the ground, his fingers still lightly grazing the cold grip of his revolver. He didn't need to hurry. He never did. But the weight of the moment pressed in on him, and he knew that this time, it wasn't just a game. Sam O'Rourke stood across from him, his posture casual but his eyes sharp. He wasn't a man who liked to waste time, but he also wasn't a man who rushed into anything without thinking. There was a calculation in the way he stood, an understanding that this was no ordinary draw. Jake's mind was clear, his breath steady. The sounds of the world around him, the wind, the rustling of the grass, the distant howls of coyotes, seemed to fade away. It was just him and Sam. It had always been this way in gunfights. Just two men, locked in a moment of uncertainty, waiting for the other to make a move. "You know why I'm here, Jake," Sam said, his voice calm, carrying over the space between them. "You've been avoiding this for too long. You can't keep running forever. I'm not here to waste my time." Jake's eyes flickered to Sam's hands, noting the subtle movement, the way his fingers twitched near his holster. But Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. Sam already knew the game. They both did. "I've got nothing left to prove, Sam," Jake said, his voice soft, but the weight of his words filled the air. "But you've made a mistake coming after me." Sam tilted his head slightly, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "A mistake? No, Jake. I think you're the one who made a mistake. You should have stayed gone. You had your chance." Jake's hand didn't move toward his gun. Not yet. He was watching Sam, Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. He had been in enough showdowns to know how quickly things could go south. There was no time for mistakes here. For a moment, neither man moved. The silence stretched out, thick with anticipation. Every part of Jake's body was on edge, but his mind was calm, focused. He had learned that in a fight, the faster hand wasn't always the winner. It was the quicker mind. Sam's eyes flickered, and in that brief instant, Jake knew exactly what he had to do. Sam had already made his move. His hand was already halfway to his revolver when Jake's shot rang out. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, splitting the air and echoing off the hills. Sam's body jerked as the bullet hit him square in the chest, his revolver falling from his hand and clattering to the dirt. His legs gave way beneath him, and he dropped to the ground with a thud, the life leaving his eyes as he lay still in the dust. Jake stood over him, his revolver still in his hand, smoke curling from the barrel. His heart was steady, but there was a familiar emptiness in his chest. This was the life he had chosen. This was the cost. Jake didn't waste time looking at Sam's body. He had done what he needed to do. He didn't take pleasure in it, but he knew that Sam wouldn't have hesitated to end his life if the roles had been reversed. As the wind picked up again, Jake holstered his gun, his movements slow and deliberate. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, even though he couldn't see anyone. They had all been watching, waiting for the inevitable. Now it was over. Jake turned and began to walk back toward the ridge, his boots kicking up dust with each step. He didn't look back. He never did. The past was a part of him, whether he liked it or not. But for now, Red Bluff was safe. And that was all that mattered. As he reached the top of the ridge, Jake stopped and looked out across the valley. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. The quiet of the evening had returned, the wind now a soft whisper against his skin. He had survived this day, but Jake knew better than to think this was the end. The West was full of men like Sam O'Rourke, men who had no respect for a man's past, only for the price on his head. Jake's hand rested once more on the cold steel of his revolver, but his mind was already elsewhere. He had made his choice. He had fought for his peace, but peace in the West was as fleeting as the desert rain. It would never last. But Jake was ready. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on. The sun had set completely now, the sky a deep purple fading into black. The only light was the dim glow of the last embers of the day, and the stars, bright and endless above the vast plains. Jake stood at the top of the ridge for a long time, his eyes scanning the horizon. The wind had softened, but there was still that familiar bite in the air, that feeling of emptiness that always followed a confrontation. He had done what he had to do. Sam O'Rourke was gone, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't really over. The world didn't just let a man like Sam go quietly. The bounty hunters would keep coming, one after another, until they wore him down or finally got lucky. It wasn't a life you escaped from. It was a life you survived as long as you could. Jake turned away from the ridge and headed back toward town. The streets of Red Bluff were empty, the saloon quiet, its windows dim with the light of a few lanterns. The town hadn't stirred since the shootout, and that was how Jake liked it. Red Bluff wasn't a place for excitement or trouble. It was a place to lay low, to catch your breath, to find some peace. He stepped into the saloon, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Tom, the bartender, was behind the counter, wiping down glasses, his face set in the kind of grim expression that came with seeing too much of the world. Jake nodded to him as he passed, but Tom didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between them was enough. Tom had seen the kind of man Jake was, and he knew better than to ask questions. The saloon wasn't crowded. A few ranchers sat around a table in the corner, their voices low, discussing the day's work. Jake wasn't interested in them. He wasn't interested in anything except for a quiet drink and the chance to breathe. He took a seat at the bar, ordered a whiskey, and let the glass sit in his hand for a moment. His fingers curled around the glass, the familiar weight of it soothing in a way. The whiskey was strong, burning as it slid down his throat. It didn't ease the tension in his chest, but it helped him think. He didn't want to stay in Red Bluff. He didn't want to stay anywhere. The thought of another showdown, another fight to the death, gnawed at the edges of his mind. But for now, He had earned a moment's rest. He wasn't going to let it slip away. As he took another drink, a voice interrupted his solitude. "You did what you had to do." Jake didn't need to turn around to know who it was. He had heard that voice before, the smooth drawl that carried the weight of 1,000 miles of dust and trouble. He knew it too well. He glanced over his shoulder and saw her standing in the doorway, framed by the soft light from outside. She was tall, dark-haired, wearing a worn leather coat and a hat that shadowed her face just enough to keep her identity hidden. Her presence filled the room like a storm cloud, unmistakable, inevitable. "Never thought I'd see you again," Jake said quietly, setting the glass down. The woman stepped forward, her boots making no sound as she walked toward the bar. She wasn't here to make small talk, and neither was Jake. They had history, too much of it, history that neither of them wanted to drag into the light. "I didn't think you'd stick around this long," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of something darker in it. "You've been running for years, Jake. You can't outrun who you are." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at his reflection in the polished wood of the bar. He could feel her eyes on him, sharp and calculating. She was a part of the past he had tried to bury, a reminder of everything he had left behind. "I don't need this," Jake said finally, his voice low but firm. "I've done enough. I got nothing to prove." Her lips curled into a slight smile, though there was no warmth in it. "You never needed to prove anything, Jake, but you can't outrun the truth. You know that." Jake shook his head, his fingers tapping idly on the edge of the bar. He didn't want to talk about this. Not now. He had left that life behind, and the last thing he wanted was for her to drag him back into it. "You're still chasing shadows," Jake muttered, his voice almost a whisper. The woman's eyes glinted. She knew how to get under his skin, how to make him doubt himself. That was what she did. That was what they had done together. Tracked down the hardest men in the West, crossed the line between law and lawlessness without a second thought. It had all ended in blood, in betrayal, in a past that neither of them could forget. "I'm not chasing shadows, Jake," she said, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm here because you can't run from what you did. You know it. I know it. We both do." Jake stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor, a flash of impatience flickering in his eyes. He didn't want to deal with this, not now. Not after everything that had happened. "I'm not that man anymore," Jake said, his voice a little harsher than he intended. "I've spent too long trying to forget what I did, trying to live a quiet life." The woman took a step closer, her presence filling the space between them. "You can try to forget, Jake. You can try to run, but you'll never escape. Not from yourself. Not from what's coming." Jake's hand tightened around his glass, the words gnawing at the back of his mind. He had tried to outrun his past for so long, but he knew, deep down, that he couldn't keep doing it forever. "So, what now?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You come back into town to remind me who I am? Or are you just here to make sure I don't leave again?" The woman's smile faded, and her eyes softened, just for a moment. "I'm here to make sure you're ready, Jake. You may think it's over, but you know as well as I do, it never really ends." Jake stood still, his fingers twitching at his side as if they were reaching for his revolver, but he stopped himself. He wasn't ready to fight this battle. Not yet. But the feeling in his chest, the one that had been there ever since Sam O'Rourke's arrival, hadn't faded. He wasn't finished here. Red Bluff wasn't the end of his story, and the road ahead was far from clear. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the wind outside seemed to swell and then fade, like an old memory. And in that silence, Jake knew one thing for sure. His past wasn't done with him. Not by a long shot. The woman's presence in the saloon seemed to draw all the air from the room, leaving Jake with the sense that he had been holding his breath for far too long. Her eyes, like two shards of ice, never left his face as she leaned against the bar, her posture casual, but her every movement betraying the tension that coiled beneath her skin. Jake wasn't sure how to feel. Her arrival, the quiet weight of her words, had left him unsettled. It was one thing to face the ghosts of your past, but when those ghosts had faces, voices, when they were alive and breathing, It felt like a different kind of weight altogether. Her gaze was unwavering, almost as though she were waiting for him to say something. But Jake couldn't find the words. What could he say to someone who had known him at his worst? Someone who had been there through it all? All he could do was hold onto his whiskey glass, the warm burn of it a brief distraction from the coldness in his chest. "I didn't expect you to still be here," Jake said, breaking the silence at last, his voice softer than he had meant it to be. The woman's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was no humor in it. "You never expect anything, Jake. That's what makes you dangerous." Jake glanced over at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Dangerous?" She gave a small shrug, not dismissive, but not particularly invested in explaining herself either. "You've got a way of surprising people, making them think you're someone you're not. You like it that way, but you're just like the rest of us, running from something, trying to outrun the past. Doesn't work that way, though. You know that." Jake gripped the glass harder, his knuckles white, the words hitting their mark despite his attempts to ignore them. She was right in some ways. He had spent years trying to outrun who he had been. But now, with her here, with the knowledge of what he was capable of sitting between them like an unspoken truth, he felt the weight of everything he had tried to leave behind. "I don't need reminding," Jake muttered. "I'm not the man I was." She was silent for a long moment, as if considering his words carefully. The weight of her gaze didn't waver, though there was a flicker of something behind her eyes, something faintly sympathetic, but it was gone before Jake could grasp it. "You think that changes what's coming?" she asked softly, her voice losing none of its edge. "You think walking away from it makes it disappear? I've seen this before, Jake. I've seen men like you. You'll never escape it. Not unless you confront it." Jake leaned back in his chair, his legs stretching out before him as he regarded her with a cool, measured gaze. "You really think I need to confront it?" His tone was mocking, though his heart was anything but light. "What do you want from me? You think I should apologize for the things I've done?" The woman didn't flinch, didn't look away. "I don't need your apology, Jake. I don't need anything from you. But you'll have to face what you've done eventually, because I can tell you this. You won't survive if you keep running." Jake's chest tightened. He wanted to laugh it off, to dismiss her words as another reminder of a life he had tried to bury. But he knew better than to pretend. He knew her well enough to understand that she wasn't the type to give advice lightly. "I'm not running anymore," Jake said, his voice firm, though it wasn't entirely convincing. He wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her, or himself. She looked at him, her eyes studying him in a way that made him feel like she could see every piece of him, every shadow, every scar. It was a feeling he had always hated, but for some reason, when it came from her, he couldn't seem to escape it. "Then maybe it's time you stop pretending," she said quietly. Jake turned away, his gaze drifting toward the door. The wind had picked up again outside, rattling the wooden frames of the saloon, but it was a sound that only served to heighten the growing tension in the room. The town was quiet, but Jake knew that wasn't going to last. He had seen this before. When things were quiet, when the air was still, it was only a matter of time before trouble came knocking. And trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how far he ran. The woman pushed herself off the bar and walked toward the door, her boots tapping against the wooden floor. As she reached for the handle, she paused, glancing back at Jake over her shoulder. "You should head for the hills," she said, her voice almost a whisper, as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "The bandits. They're already making their way to town. They'll be here by morning." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The bandits. The ones who had been causing trouble across New Mexico for months. Jake had heard the stories, robberies, murders, chaos. He had hoped they wouldn't come this way. But now, with the woman standing there, her warning hanging in the air, Jake knew it was time to move. But the thing was, Jake wasn't one to run. Not from bandits, not from anyone. Not after everything he had survived. He pushed his chair back and stood up slowly, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady. She turned fully now, her eyes locking onto his. "You think you can face them alone? The whole gang?" Jake gave a slight, humorless smile. "I've faced worse." She regarded him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Finally, she gave a small nod, as if she had expected that response. "Then I guess we'll see who's faster," she said quietly, her words hanging in the air as she stepped out into the night. Jake stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't the kind of fight he had wanted, but it was the fight he had. And in the end, it would be the last one he faced in Red Bluff. The cold night air hit Jake as soon as he stepped out of the saloon, the wind biting at his skin, sending a shiver down his spine. The town was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of the night, dogs barking in the distance, the faint clink of metal from the stables, the whisper of wind in the trees, were absent. It was a deep, unnatural silence that made Jake uneasy. Something was coming, something bigger than just a few bandits looking for trouble. The woman, he hadn't caught her name, but he'd known her long enough to read her like an open book. Hadn't given him much information, but he didn't need it. He could feel it in his gut. A storm was on the horizon, and it wasn't going to pass quietly. The bandits were close. They were always close. Jake pulled the collar of his coat up around his neck and walked toward the edge of town, his boots kicking up the dust of the road. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew one thing. He wasn't about to let these men come into Red Bluff and terrorize the people. The town had already been through too much in the last few hours. Sam O'Rourke's arrival, the mocking words of the bandits, the showdown in the street. It had all led to this moment. Jake wasn't going to let it end with more bloodshed. The stars above shone bright, casting a pale glow over the land. The world felt vast, open, and empty, but Jake knew better. Out here in the wilderness, nothing was ever truly empty. There was always something lurking, waiting for its chance to strike. He moved cautiously, staying in the shadows of the buildings and alleyways, his hand resting on the revolver at his side. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew that something was off. The stillness of the town, the way the wind had died down earlier, the absence of any sound. It all pointed to the same thing. Trouble was close. Too close. As Jake made his way to the outskirts of town, he paused near the old stable. It was quiet here, too. No animals, no movement, nothing. He leaned against the wall for a moment, listening. The wind had died completely now, replaced by the soft thrum of his own heartbeat in his ears. Then, he heard it. The faint sound of hooves in the distance, the muffled thud of horses galloping in the dark. His hand went instinctively to his gun, his fingers brushing the cool metal of the Colt .45. They were here. The bandits had arrived, and they were coming in fast. Jake's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. He knew they wouldn't be far behind. The road leading into Red Bluff from the west was mostly empty, nothing but open plains and sparse vegetation stretching out to the horizon. But the land could hide men just as easily as it could reveal them. The bandits could be anywhere. The sound of hooves grew louder. Jake tensed, stepping back into the shadow of the stable, his revolver now fully drawn and at the ready. He had to stay calm. The last thing he needed was to be caught off guard. The moment they showed themselves, he had to be faster than they were. And then, like a sudden wave, the bandits emerged from the darkness. 6 of them, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats, their bodies cloaked in the dust of the road. They rode in a tight formation, moving with the precision of men who knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't just out for a raid, they were hunting. Jake's heart raced as he counted them, his mind calculating his options. He had no backup. He was alone. These men weren't like the ones from earlier. These weren't the drunken fools who had mocked him. These men had a purpose. They were dangerous, and they didn't plan on leaving Red Bluff without getting what they wanted. One of the riders, the leader by the looks of it, broke away from the group and rode ahead, stopping in the middle of the street. He raised his hand, signaling to the others to halt. Jake watched from his position, keeping his body pressed against the stable wall. The leader looked around, his eyes scanning the buildings, the saloon, and the small houses that lined the street. Then his gaze flicked to the shadows where Jake was hiding. The man seemed to know exactly where Jake was, as if he had been expecting him. Well, the leader called out, his voice loud enough for Jake to hear clearly. The quiet cowboy finally shows himself. Thought you'd just let us walk into town and take whatever we wanted. Huh? Jake didn't move, didn't say anything. He wasn't going to give this man the satisfaction of a response. He knew what was coming. The leader would talk a big game, throw some threats around, and then the rest of the gang would try to overwhelm him. But Jake had seen this show before. The only question was whether he'd be able to finish it this time. "Not going to answer me, cowboy?" the leader shouted again, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're a hard man to get a rise out of, but I reckon that's about to change. We're going to take this town, and you're going to watch. Or maybe you'll want to play hero, huh?" The leader signaled to his men, who moved to spread out, each taking a position in the street, their eyes scanning the buildings, searching for any sign of resistance. Jake knew that once they spotted him, there would be no holding back. He had to move fast. His hand tightened around the grip of his revolver. He was ready. He had always been ready. But before he could make a move, the woman's voice broke through the tension. "Not so fast," she said from the shadows. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he turned to see her standing near the saloon door, her hand resting on the rifle at her side. The bandits froze. The leader's eyes flicked toward her, his expression darkening. "You've got a nerve, lady," he spat. "This town's ours now. You'd better get out of our way before we make you." The woman stepped forward, her stance steady, her eyes locked on the leader. "This town belongs to the people who live here," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "And you'll have to go through me to take it." Jake didn't have to say a word. He knew exactly what she meant. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for Red Bluff itself. And as long as he was standing, there was no way he was going to let these men take it without a fight. The tension in the air was thick, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Jake Holbrook's hand rested lightly on the grip of his revolver, his muscles coiled, every nerve alive with the knowledge that this moment, this fight, would be unlike any he had ever faced. The woman stood in the shadows, her rifle ready, her eyes sharp as knives. The bandits had drawn their weapons, fingers twitching at the holsters, all of them keenly aware of the danger now present in Red Bluff. The leader, still on his horse, looked between the woman and Jake, his mouth twisting into a sneer. "You think you're the law around here?" he asked, his voice cold with contempt. "You think you're going to stop me and my men from taking what we want?" The woman didn't flinch. Her eyes remained steady, her fingers gripping the rifle with ease. She was in control, even if the odds were stacked against them. "The people of this town don't belong to you," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the street. "You're just passing through, and you've made a big mistake." Jake's eyes narrowed. The leader had underestimated them. He thought this would be an easy job. Come in, take what they wanted, scare the locals, and leave with no resistance. But this wasn't going to be easy. Not with Jake standing in the way. Not with the woman making it clear she wasn't backing down either. For a moment, everything was still. Jake's fingers twitched at the revolver again. He was ready, but he wasn't going to be the one to draw first. Not unless he had to. The woman's presence had shifted the balance in their favor. She wasn't going to let these men have their way. The leader's eyes flicked to his men, and Jake saw it then. The hesitation, the doubt. The bandits weren't used to facing opposition like this. They were used to easy targets, towns with no backbone, people who didn't know how to fight back. They hadn't counted on a man like Jake Holbrook and a woman who knew how to stand her ground. Without warning, one of the bandits, short and wiry, with a scar running down his neck, made a move. He spurred his horse forward, his gun drawn in an instant, aiming at the woman. Jake's instincts kicked in. He didn't think. He just moved. The sound of a gunshot rang out, sharp and sudden, breaking the silence of the night. The bandit's arm jerked back, and his revolver went flying from his grip. He screamed in pain as he was knocked off his horse and sent sprawling into the dirt. Jake's shot was already spent, his revolver still smoking. He didn't wait for the next move. The bandits froze in place, their eyes wide, the sudden violence shocking them into inaction. The leader's face twisted into a snarl. "You damn fool!" he shouted at the fallen man. But the damage was already done. The first shot had already made it clear that this wasn't going to be the easy job they thought it would be. Jake stood still, his eyes locked on the leader, his revolver ready in his hand. He had fired first, but he wasn't interested in playing games. He was here to stop them, not to waste time talking. The bandits slowly started to dismount, one by one, their eyes flicking nervously between Jake and the woman, unsure of whether they should retreat or press forward. But the leader, ever the calculating one, raised his hand, signaling for them to hold their ground. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice seething with anger. "This isn't over, cowboy." Jake didn't flinch. He didn't need to say anything. His hand tightened around the grip of his revolver, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The showdown was coming, and the bandits had no idea how outmatched they were. "We're not going anywhere," the leader growled, but even as he spoke, the doubt was clear in his eyes. He had seen Jake's speed, felt the sting of his bullet. He knew they couldn't take him down that easily. Jake's voice was quiet, but firm, carrying the weight of experience. "I'll give you one chance," he said. "Get on your horses and leave. Now." The wind howled through the street, but there was no response. The bandits weren't backing down. They couldn't. They had come for Red Bluff, and they weren't about to leave empty-handed. But they had no idea what they were truly up against. The leader's hand dropped toward his revolver, but he wasn't quick enough. Jake's reflexes were faster, sharper. The second the man moved, Jake fired again. The sound of the second shot was almost deafening. The leader's body jerked violently as the bullet hit him square in the chest. He went down hard, his revolver clattering to the ground as he collapsed into the dirt, life fading from his eyes in an instant. The remaining bandits hesitated, their faces pale, the shock of seeing their leader go down flashing in their eyes. But they weren't cowards, not entirely. They raised their guns, aiming for Jake and the woman. But before they could fire, a voice called out from behind them, "Hold it right there." The bandits froze. Jake didn't have to look to know who it was. The woman stepped forward, her rifle raised, the barrel aimed at the remaining three. Her stance was calm, confident, but there was no mistaking the danger in her eyes. "I'd drop that gun if I were you," she said coolly, her voice a knife cutting through the tension. "You won't get another chance." The remaining bandits exchanged glances, the weight of their situation sinking in. They were outgunned, outnumbered. They had thought they could control Red Bluff, take what they wanted, but they hadn't counted on Jake and the woman standing between them and victory. The first bandit, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, took a step back, his hand slowly lowering his revolver. The others followed suit, their faces filled with uncertainty and fear. They had come for a fight, but they hadn't expected this kind of fight. "Get out of here," Jake said, his voice low but commanding. "And don't come back." One by one, the bandits slowly backed away, their eyes flicking nervously between Jake, the woman, and the lifeless body of their leader in the dirt. Without another word, they mounted their horses and rode off, disappearing into the night like the cowards they were. Jake stood still, watching them go, his hand still on the revolver, just in case they decided to turn around. But they didn't. They were gone. The woman lowered her rifle, her eyes flicking to Jake. "You're a hell of a shot," she said quietly. Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. The danger had passed, for now, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Red Bluff might have been safe for the moment, but trouble had a way of finding men like him. And Jake Holbrook wasn't done yet. The last echoes of hooves faded into the night, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the dry grasses and the distant howl of coyotes. The street was still. Red Bluff, once again, seemed like a sleepy little town. But Jake knew it wouldn't stay that way. Not forever. Jake holstered his revolver, his hand lingering for a moment on the grip, the weight of it a constant reminder of the life he'd left behind. The woman had lowered her rifle and was now standing beside him, her gaze scanning the empty street. She wasn't done with him. Neither of them was. "Nice shooting," she said, her voice carrying that familiar edge, the kind that came from experience. There was no admiration in her words, just simple acknowledgement. "But you know it's not over." Jake didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. He didn't need to hear that the fight wasn't over. He knew it. They both did. "You're right," he said finally, his voice low. "It never is." The woman glanced at him, her face unreadable. She seemed to study him, as if trying to gauge whether he was truly ready for what lay ahead, or if he had already decided that he was done with all of it. She wasn't the kind of person to waste time on a man who wasn't serious. "Sam O'Rourke won't be the last," she said, her eyes flicking toward the horizon. "There are more men like him out there, and they're looking for you." Jake nodded. He knew the score. It didn't matter how fast he could draw or how well he could fight. Men like Sam weren't the end of his troubles. They were the beginning. The world didn't let go of men like him. It never did. But that didn't mean Jake was going to just roll over. He had made it this far by standing his ground, and he wasn't about to start running now. "I didn't ask for this," Jake said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I didn't ask for them to come here." The woman gave a short laugh, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that sounded like humor. It was more like the sound of someone who had seen too much to care about any of it anymore. "None of us do," she replied. "None of us ask for it. But it's the world we live in. The world you've lived in. You think you can just hide out here, settle down, but it doesn't work that way." Jake's eyes darkened, and for a moment, he looked away. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, Red Bluff would be different. He'd hoped that he could leave that life behind. Find peace, find a place to just exist. But peace wasn't something men like him got to keep, and he had known that all along. "You're right," he said, his voice steady now, though it was laced with the weight of resignation. "I can't outrun it forever. I never could." The woman stepped closer, her eyes sharp. She was waiting for him to make his decision, waiting for him to choose what kind of man he was going to be now. Was he going to keep running, or was he going to face what came next? "You don't have to fight alone," she said quietly, her voice softer now. "I can help you. We can handle this together." Jake looked at her, his mind running through the possibilities. She was right. He wasn't alone. But even with her help, they were up against a force that neither of them could truly escape. The bandits would come again. The bounty hunters, the outlaws, they were all looking for him. He had spent so much of his life trying to outrun it, trying to bury that part of himself. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to confront it, to finish what he had started all those years ago. Jake took a deep breath, letting the air settle in his chest. The decision was made. He wasn't running anymore. "I don't know if we can win this," he said, his voice low, but filled with resolve. "But I'm not going down without a fight." The woman gave him a small nod, as if she had expected this response. She hadn't been sure at first, but now, she knew. Jake Holbrook was ready for whatever came next. "I'm with you," she said simply. "But don't think this is going to be easy. They'll keep coming. And every man you kill, every time you survive, they'll just send more." Jake didn't flinch at her words. He had known that all along. He wasn't in this to win some moral victory. He was in it to survive. "I'm not looking for easy," Jake said with a grim smile. "I'm looking for a way out, and I'm willing to fight for it." They stood there in silence for a moment, the wind picking up again, swirling the dust in the street. The night felt endless, like the weight of everything that had come before was settling on their shoulders. Finally, the woman spoke again, her voice softer, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "We'll have to be ready. They'll be here by morning." Jake looked at her, his gaze hardening. "Then we'll be ready." He turned and walked toward the saloon, the woman following him closely. Inside, the patrons were still silent, still processing the events of the night. They hadn't expected a fight. They hadn't expected Jake Holbrook to be a man who would stand up to the bandits and make them pay for their arrogance. But Jake wasn't just a quiet cowboy. Not anymore. "I'll need more ammo," Jake said as he walked past the bar. Tom, the bartender, nodded, not asking any questions. He had seen enough in his life to know when a man was preparing for a war. Jake had already taken care of the town once tonight. Tom wasn't going to stand in his way. The woman stepped to the side, her eyes scanning the room. She wasn't here for conversation. She was here for one thing: survival. Jake stood by the counter, his eyes never leaving the door, the sound of the wind outside now like a distant rumble of thunder, a storm that was about to break. He had made his choice. There was no turning back now. The night had drawn on, and the town of Red Bluff was quiet once again, though the air was thick with anticipation. The stars above were dimmed by the dust storm creeping across the horizon, and Jake knew that by dawn, the quiet would be shattered. The bandits hadn't left for good, not by a long shot. He had bought them a little time, but not nearly enough. And with the woman by his side, there was no turning back. Jake stood at the bar, his hands steady despite the tension that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He had already checked his revolver and gathered more ammunition. He wasn't going to make the mistake of being unprepared again. He wasn't going to let anyone take Red Bluff, not while he was still breathing. But even as he prepared for what was coming, a part of him wondered just how much fight he had left in him. The woman had already stepped outside, her figure vanishing into the darkness, no doubt preparing herself for what lay ahead. Jake didn't need to follow her. He knew what she was doing, scouting the perimeter, watching the roads for any sign of movement. But Jake wasn't one for pacing. He preferred to stay still, think things through before rushing headfirst into a fight. It was a method he had perfected over the years, the ability to wait until the moment was right. And the moment wasn't right just yet. Tom, the bartender, had returned to his work, but his eyes were on Jake. He didn't need to say anything. The concern was clear in the old man's face. Tom had lived a long life in this town. He had seen trouble come and go, and he had seen men like Jake. Men who got caught between the world they had been part of and the one they had tried to leave behind. "You're sure about this, Jake?" Tom asked quietly, his voice low so as not to draw attention. Jake didn't turn to look at him immediately. He just stared out the window, watching the empty street stretch out into the night. "There's no other way," he said, his voice flat. "They're coming. You know it. I know it. Might as well meet them head on." Tom grunted, clearly not satisfied with the answer. But there was no point in arguing. Jake had made his decision. Tom had seen enough to know that once Jake made up his mind, nothing could change it. "I don't want any trouble," Tom said, his voice a bit more resigned. "This place has been a quiet one for a long time. I don't need it turning into a graveyard." Jake finally looked at him, his face grim. "I'm not looking to turn it into a graveyard. But if they come in here looking for trouble, I'll make sure they don't get what they want." The saloon was still quiet, but the air was thick with an unspoken understanding. Everyone in town knew what was coming, and no one was sure how it would end. But Jake was ready to make his stand. He wasn't the man he used to be, but that didn't mean he was going to let someone walk over him, or let this town fall. "You won't be alone, Jake," Tom said after a pause. "There's folks around here who still remember what it's like to fight." Jake's gaze softened just slightly, though the weight of the situation was still heavy on him. "I'm not asking anyone to fight. This is mine to deal with." Tom nodded, but Jake saw the glint of determination in his eyes. Tom wasn't saying it aloud, but he was ready to stand with Jake, if only in spirit. The door creaked open, and the woman stepped back inside, her expression unreadable. She had the look of someone who had been preparing for a fight, eyes sharp, body tense, but there was a quiet resolve in the way she moved. "Anything?" Jake asked, his voice steady, though the tension in his chest was growing. "They're coming," she said. "A small group, but they've got their eyes set on Red Bluff. They're too cocky to sneak in under the cover of darkness. They're making a statement." Jake nodded. The time had come. There would be no more waiting. He stood up, checking the revolver at his side, making sure the chamber was full. He wasn't going to waste a single shot. "We'll make our stand here," he said, his voice low but firm. "In the street. When they come, we hit him hard." She met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "You know what's at stake." Jake's eyes flicked to the door, his heart racing with the knowledge of what was to come. He didn't want to drag anyone else into this, but he wasn't about to let these men take Red Bluff. He'd rather face them down himself than watch the town fall to pieces. "I know," he said, "but it's my fight, and I'll finish it." The woman didn't argue, but there was a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, or recognition, in her eyes. She understood what Jake was willing to sacrifice. She wasn't the type to shy away from a fight either, and for that, Jake was grateful. But this was his responsibility. He wasn't going to let the ghosts of his past drag more people into the fire. The wind howled outside, and the town seemed to hold its breath. There was a storm on the horizon, but Jake wasn't sure if it was the weather or the coming battle that was weighing on him. His muscles were tense, his heart racing, but there was also a strange calmness in his chest. He had spent too many years running, avoiding trouble, but now, the The trouble had come to him, and there was no way out except through. "We wait," Jake said, his voice almost a whisper. The woman nodded, stepping back toward the door. She wasn't going anywhere. She was with him until the end. Jake moved to the window, keeping his eyes trained on the road ahead. He didn't expect them to be here immediately. They wouldn't rush in. The bandits were smart. They would wait for the right moment. But Jake would be ready for them. And when the time came, he'd make sure they knew this town wasn't theirs for the taking. The quiet was broken by the distant sound of hooves, faint but growing louder. The bandits were coming, and Jake wasn't going to let them have Red Bluff without a fight. The sound of hooves grew louder, each thundering step reverberating through the still air of Red Bluff. Jake stood at the window, his eyes fixed on the distant road, his hand gripping the handle of his revolver with practiced ease. The woman was already by the door, her rifle in hand, eyes scanning the street, waiting for the moment when the bandits would finally come into view. Jake's pulse quickened, but his body remained steady. The years of running, hiding, and avoiding confrontation had led to this final standoff. He couldn't afford to let the fear show, not now. If the bandits thought for 1 second that he was afraid, they would have the upper hand. And that was something Jake couldn't allow. The woman, standing tall and ready, shifted her weight, adjusting her grip on the rifle. She was a force to be reckoned with, just as capable as Jake in a fight. But Jake wasn't concerned with her ability to shoot. He knew she could handle herself. What concerned him was what lay ahead. What the bandits would do when they realized they were outmatched. Would they back down? Or would they make Red Bluff their battleground? The wind blew through the streets again, kicking up dust, but the world felt as if it had gone quiet, holding its breath for what was to come. The hooves were almost upon them. It was time. Jake turned toward the door, his eyes locking with the woman's. There was no need for words. She knew as well as he did what was about to happen. They had only one choice: stand and fight, or give the town over to men who cared nothing for its people. "They're almost here," the woman murmured, her voice calm. But Jake could hear the edge in it. The readiness, the anticipation of the battle that was coming. "Stay sharp." Jake nodded, not breaking his focus. He had already made up his mind. No more running, no more hiding. He was done with that life. This was his stand. The first rider appeared, just a silhouette in the growing dusk, a figure on horseback, leaning forward, clearly in a hurry. Behind him, Jake could make out the rest of the group, 6 riders in total, spread out and riding hard, kicking up dust in their wake. Jake's hand moved to the handle of his revolver, his fingers tightening around it, but he didn't pull it yet. He had to wait, had to be patient. One wrong move, one premature shot, and it could all be over before it started. The bandits stopped at the far end of the street, their horses snorting, their eyes scanning the town. They knew something wasn't right. Jake could see the way their leader, the tall man with the scarred face, looked around. He wasn't foolish enough to think it would be an easy takeover. The woman stepped into the doorway, blocking the entrance with her body, her rifle trained on the leader of the gang. The tension in the air grew thicker, every breath feeling heavier than the last. Jake stepped out from behind the cover of the window, moving slowly into the middle of the street, his eyes locked on the bandit leader. "You're not welcome here," Jake called, his voice steady, not giving any indication of the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You should turn around and leave." The leader smirked, a twisted, arrogant grin spreading across his face as he looked Jake up and down. "And what's a lone cowboy like you gonna do to stop us?" he shouted back, his voice carrying through the streets. "This town's ours now, friend. You and your little friend can't do a thing about it." Jake didn't flinch. He wasn't going to back down. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect this town. You don't belong here, and I'm not gonna let you take it without a fight." The leader's eyes flicked toward the woman in the doorway, his smirk faltering for a moment before he turned his attention back to Jake. "A little late for heroics, don't you think?" he sneered. "You think you can take on 6 of us?" Jake's fingers tightened around the revolver, his stance steady. He had done this 100 times before. There was no fear, only focus. It was either them or him. "Last chance," Jake said, his voice low but cutting through the dust. "Turn around. Leave while you still can." For a moment, There was only silence, the wind swirling around them. Then, without warning, the leader raised his hand, signaling to his men. The gang started to dismount, each one moving with the practiced ease of men who had done this 1,000 times. They were planning on a shootout, and Jake knew it. They were going to make their move, and when they did, it was going to happen fast. Jake's hand moved to his revolver, his eyes never leaving the leader. The moment the first man reached for his gun, Jake would fire. And then it happened. The bandits began to draw, one by one, their hands moving toward their holsters. The first man was barely halfway through drawing his weapon before Jake's revolver was already out, his shot ringing through the air, loud and sharp in the stillness of the street. The first bandit dropped to the ground, his hand still reaching for his revolver, but too slow. The rest of the gang hesitated, stunned by the speed of Jake's draw. Before they could react, the woman fired, her rifle booming with a deafening crack. Another bandit went down, clutching his chest, his revolver falling from his hand as he fell backward onto the dusty street. The remaining 4 bandits reacted quickly, but it wasn't fast enough. Jake was already on them, his revolver moving in smooth, practiced motions. The third bandit reached for his gun, but Jake's shot was already on its way, the bullet finding its mark and sending the man sprawling. The street erupted in chaos. Shots rang out, but Jake and the woman were already 2 steps ahead, moving with the kind of deadly efficiency that only came from years of experience. The remaining bandits hesitated, their confidence wavering as their comrades fell one by one. The leader, realizing that his plan was falling apart, made one last desperate move. He drew his revolver, aiming at Jake, his hand shaking with rage. But Jake was faster. His revolver roared to life again, and the leader's shot missed by inches as he crumpled to the ground, a red stain spreading across his chest. In the span of a few seconds, it was over. The bandits who were still alive were either on the ground, wounded, or scrambling to get away. Jake's heart was still pounding, his muscles tense, but the fight was done. Jake holstered his gun slowly, his eyes scanning the street, making sure it was truly over. The woman lowered her rifle, her gaze sweeping the fallen bandits, her body still coiled with readiness. She didn't relax. Not yet. We're not done yet, Jake said, his voice heavy but determined. There'll be more. The woman nodded, her expression unreadable. We'll be ready. Jake looked at the bodies lying in the street. The fight was won for now, but Jake knew better than to think that meant peace was on the way. As long as he was breathing, there would always be another fight. But Red Bluff had just learned what happened when someone came looking for trouble. They got a fight. And Jake Holbrook was ready for whatever came next. The street of Red Bluff lay still in the aftermath of the gunfight, the silence almost oppressive. Dust swirled lazily in the air, swirling around the fallen bodies of the bandits and clinging to the empty bottles in the saloon windows. The moonlight cast long shadows across the street, and Jake Holbrook stood at the center, his revolver still in hand, his breath steady but deep. The fight had ended just as quickly as it had begun. The bandits had underestimated him, underestimated the woman, and in the end, that had been their mistake. Now, the cold silence of the night seemed to press in on him from all sides, like the calm before the storm. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow and holstered his revolver. His heart was still racing, adrenaline pumping through his veins, but there was no time for relief. He had to stay sharp. The woman moved toward the fallen men, checking to make sure they were all down. Her eyes flicked over the bodies with practiced ease, confirming that none of them were getting back up. She was quick, efficient, her movements fluid like she'd done this 100 times before, and she had. "You're sure they're all dead?" Jake asked, though he knew the answer. He wasn't asking for confirmation so much as giving himself a moment to process what had just happened. A small part of him had hoped they wouldn't have to take it that far. "Yeah," she said, her voice calm, though there was a tension in her posture, an alertness that never fully left. She turned to face him. "I'll take care of the bodies. You should check the town." Jake nodded, still feeling the weight of the moment in his chest. He couldn't help but glance at the bodies, lying lifeless in the street. He wasn't proud of what had happened, but he couldn't feel guilty either. They had come here to take this town. They had made the first move, and Jake had finished it. In the West, a man didn't get many chances to survive. You took what you could get. We've got to be ready for anyone else, Jake said, his voice low but firm. They're bound to have friends in these parts. We can't just assume this is over. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. She knew exactly what he meant. There were always more. The ones who came in on horseback, the ones who followed the scent of blood like vultures. They wouldn't stop until Red Bluff was either burned to the ground or they'd taken everything of value from it. I'll make sure no one comes through the pass unnoticed, she said. But you need to check the saloon. If anyone survived, they'll head there. Jake nodded. We'll do it together. He took a deep breath, shaking off the remnants of the fight and moving toward the saloon. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the hinges protesting the intrusion. The quiet inside was almost suffocating. A few lamps were still lit, their flickering light casting long shadows across the room. The smell of gunpowder, sweat, and blood lingered in the air. Jake scanned the room, his eyes catching the outlines of the tables and chairs. It was empty, save for the body of one of the fallen bandits, slumped in the corner. He didn't need to check for a pulse. The man was long dead, his face frozen in the terror of the final moment. Jake's gaze moved toward the bar, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw movement behind it. His heart skipped a beat, and his hand moved instinctively to the grip of his revolver, but the woman was already in the doorway, rifle at the ready. Anyone here? Jake asked, his voice still steady despite the tension he could feel mounting. The woman didn't answer immediately. She was already scanning the room, her eyes darting over every corner, every shadow. Her gun was trained on the back of the room, where the narrow hallway led to the storage area. Then she stepped forward, her voice low, clear. No one left. Jake sighed, lowering his gun. But he didn't relax. Not yet. Let's check the back, Jake said, nodding toward the hallway. He knew this part of town. There was an old cellar under the saloon that had been used for storage, but it also made a good hiding spot for anyone who wanted to avoid being caught. They moved together, quiet as shadows, their boots making barely a sound on the floor. The back room was dark, but the faint glow of the lantern from the saloon cast an eerie light. When they reached the cellar door, Jake paused, his hand resting on the cold metal handle. If anyone's hiding down there, now's the time to come out, Jake called, his voice strong, his words carrying through the silence. There was no point in pretending. If someone had been foolish enough to hide, they were out of luck. The cellar door creaked as Jake pushed it open, the musty smell of old wood and damp earth wafting up. For a moment, all was still. There was no sound, no movement. Jake stepped forward, his eyes adjusting to the low light as he descended the stairs. The woman followed closely, her rifle held at the ready. Down in the cellar, the air was thick, and the walls were lined with barrels, crates, and old sacks of grain. It was a storage area, but it had been used for much worse things in the past. Jake's eyes moved over the room, checking every corner, every shadow. And then he saw it. A figure huddled in the corner. A man, tall, ragged, with a dark beard and eyes full of fear. He was holding a revolver, but it was shaking in his hand, and he looked like he had no idea how to use it. "You're not going to get away with this," the man said, his voice shaky, but defiant. Jake took a step forward, his revolver already in his hand. "I'm not here to hurt you," Jake said calmly, his eyes never leaving the man. "But if you don't put that gun down, I will." The man hesitated, his hand trembling, and then slowly, he lowered the revolver to the ground. Jake motioned for him to stay where he was, keeping his gun trained on the man. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice low but firm. "What's your part in all of this?" The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Jake and the woman. I wasn't part of the plan. I was just trying to survive." Jake studied him for a moment, weighing his options. He didn't trust this man, but at the same time, he wasn't about to shoot him without knowing more. "You're going to answer some questions," Jake said. "Then you'll leave Red Bluff and never come back. If I catch you here again, I won't hesitate." The man nodded quickly, his hands shaking as he sat down against one of the barrels. "I'll go. I promise. Just let me go." Jake exchanged a glance with the woman, who gave him a subtle nod. They had their answers. For now, the town was safe. But Jake knew it wouldn't last. There would always be more trouble. The West was full of it. And as long as men like him were alive, the storm would keep coming. The man, trembling as he sat against the barrel, knew better than to try anything funny. His gaze darted nervously between Jake and the woman. Jake didn't take his eyes off him, his revolver still drawn, the barrel cool against his fingers. The air in the cellar was thick, heavy with the dust of years gone by, and the sound of the man's shallow breaths filled the space. "You weren't here for the fight," Jake said, his voice low and measured. "So why were you with them?" The man swallowed hard, his gaze flicking nervously toward the stairs, then back to Jake. I didn't have a choice. They promised me money. I thought I could just ride along, get my cut. I didn't know they were gonna attack a town like this. I swear." Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure whether to believe him. He'd heard enough lies in his time to know that words could be just as dangerous as bullets. Still, the man hadn't fired, hadn't run, and his shaking hands told Jake that he was more afraid than anything else. Maybe that fear was enough to save him, for now. The woman stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice low, her rifle still slung across her back. "Jim," the man replied quickly. "Jim Hawkins." Jake didn't lower his gun. "And where do you plan on going now, Jim?" "I'm just gonna leave," Jim said quickly, his hands shaking as he clutched his coat. "I'll leave, I swear. I don't want no more trouble." Jake glanced at the woman, his eyes hard. She met his gaze, and for a moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. They didn't need to waste more time on this man. Red Bluff wasn't a place for second chances, at least not for someone who had been with men like those bandits. "You'll leave," Jake said, his voice cold, "and you'll never come back. If you do, I won't hesitate to put you down. Got it?" Jim nodded vigorously, a desperate look in his eyes. Yeah, I won't be back. You won't see me again. I swear it." Jake kept his revolver trained on him for a moment longer, ensuring that the man understood the weight of his words. Then, without another word, he turned and motioned to the woman. She followed him up the stairs, their boots creaking on the old wood. As they emerged back into the quiet streets of Red Bluff, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the horizon, turning the sky a faint shade of orange. It was an eerie, peaceful kind of light, the calm after the storm. But Jake knew better than to relax just yet. He turned to the woman, his jaw tightening. "What now?" She gave him a grim smile. "Now we wait. Word will spread. More will come." Jake didn't need to ask her what she meant. More bandits. More trouble. It was the way of the West. And Red Bluff, quiet as it might seem, had just become a target. The people in this town had learned something important last night. Trouble never stays gone for long. "You're right," Jake said, rubbing a hand across his face, weary but resolute. "It won't end with them. It never does." The woman stepped closer, her eyes scanning the street. "I'll make sure no one gets through the passes unnoticed. We'll be ready." Jake nodded, the weight of the coming days settling heavily on his shoulders. There was no turning back now. He had made his stand. Red Bluff was safe, for the time being, but the storm had only begun. "We need to fortify," Jake said after a pause, his voice low and steady. "If we don't show them we're not afraid, they'll just keep coming. We can't let that happen." The woman's eyes softened, just for a moment. "You're a good man, Jake," she said quietly, as though the words were an acknowledgement of something far deeper than just what had transpired that night. Jake didn't respond right away. He wasn't interested in flattery, but there was something about the way she looked at him, something that told him she saw him as more than just the gunfighter he had become. They had both been living in the shadows of their pasts for far too long, but maybe, just maybe, they could still find something in each other that was worth fighting for. "Let's get to work," Jake said finally, his voice firm. The woman gave him a nod and headed toward the edge of town. Jake followed her with his eyes for a moment before turning back to the saloon. There was still much to be done, and the people of Red Bluff needed to know that they weren't alone. They needed to feel like they had a chance, even in the face of what was coming. As Jake moved through the streets, He could already hear the murmur of the town waking up. Some of the ranchers had started to gather in the square, their voices low, filled with the nervous tension that had overtaken the place since the bandits had first appeared. Jake was sure they had all heard the gunfire. They had heard the shots, felt the earth tremble with the weight of it. By the time Jake reached the saloon, most of the town had gathered near the center, waiting for the next move. They were looking to him for answers, for guidance. Jake knew what they were expecting. They were expecting him to lead them, to show them how to survive. They were looking to him, a man with a past too dark to ignore, for hope in a world that had long since given up on it. Jake turned back to the group, his eyes scanning the faces of the townsfolk. They were tired, nervous, but determined. They weren't giving up, not while he was still standing. Jake stood tall, his hand resting at his side, his mind sharp despite the weariness of his body. "We're going to fight for this town," he said, his voice steady. "And I'm not doing it alone. We stand together, or we fall apart. No one is walking away from this." The town was quiet for a moment, but as Jake's words hung in the air, the silence was broken by the sound of boots shifting in the dirt, a few murmurs of agreement. Slowly, but surely, the people of Red Bluff began to rally behind him. Jake didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. This town would not fall without a fight, and he would lead them, no matter what it took. The town of Red Bluff stood on the edge of the desert, a small, weather-worn speck on the vast, endless plains of the west. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long, slanted rays across the dirt streets, painting the town in a golden hue that felt far too serene for the tension that gripped it. Jake Holbrook stood at the front of the saloon, his eyes scanning the horizon. He hadn't expected to be here, to be in this position, but circumstances had a way of changing a man's path, of forcing him to become something he hadn't planned on. Now, as he stood with the people of Red Bluff behind him, preparing for the storm that was sure to come, Jake wondered if there was any other way. But he knew better. There was no running. Not anymore. The woman had gone off to check the perimeter, her sharp eyes always on the lookout for danger. She had a quiet, dangerous kind of efficiency about her that Jake appreciated. She had been by his side through too many battles to count, but this was different. The stakes were higher. The bandits weren't just here for a few cattle or a handful of supplies. They were here to make a point, to take control of the town. And Jake wasn't going to let them do that. "You're sure about this?" Tom, the bartender, asked quietly as he stepped up beside Jake. "It's not gonna be easy." Jake didn't look at him at first. He knew Tom had seen more than his fair share of trouble over the years. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about standing for something. "I'm sure," Jake said, his voice firm. "We fight, or we lose." Tom nodded slowly, his eyes moving toward the horizon. It's been a long time since anyone stood up to the likes of them. Jake turned to face him now, his expression calm but serious. "This town's not giving up without a fight." Tom met his gaze, and for a moment, Jake saw something in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Determination. The old man might not have been a gunfighter, but he had seen enough to know what needed to be done. As the sun rose higher, the town started to come alive. The few remaining ranchers gathered in the square, their faces lined with worry, but they were ready. They had heard the shots the night before, seen the blood spilled in the street, and they knew what was at stake. They were no longer just bystanders in their own town. They were fighters. Whether they had ever fired a gun or not, they were about to find out what they were made of. Jake turned back toward the woman as she emerged from the shadows of the alley, her eyes scanning the street. She didn't say anything, but the look she gave him was all he needed. She was ready, and he knew it. "They're coming," she said simply. Jake didn't respond at first. He only nodded. It wasn't a surprise. He had known this was coming since the moment the bandits rode into town, but the reality of it still settled in his chest like a weight. His hand drifted to his revolver again, the familiar weight of the gun reassuring him. He had spent so many years honing his skill, so many years living with the fear that he was running from something. But now he wasn't running. Not anymore. "We make our stand here," Jake said. "If they want this town, they'll have to fight for it." The woman gave him a nod, her rifle slung across her back, her stance relaxed but tense, ready for the moment when everything would explode. Jake took a deep breath, letting the stillness of the morning settle into his bones. In the distance, he could hear the sound of hooves again, faint but growing louder. They were coming. The bandits. Are we going to give them the fight they're looking for? The woman asked, her voice almost a whisper. Jake turned toward her. We're going to give them the fight they didn't expect. She gave him a quick, sharp smile, a flash of approval in her eyes. But there was no time for pleasantries. They had made their stand. Now they had to hold it. As the sound of hooves grew louder, Jake took one last look at the townspeople gathered in the square. They were all standing behind him now. Whether they had ever held a gun in their hands or not, they were ready to fight for their town, for their home. Jake stepped into the street, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. He moved toward the edge of town, where the first riders would appear. His eyes locked onto the horizon, and his mind sharpened with the knowledge that there was no turning back. The woman stepped up beside him, and the two of them stood there, waiting. The bandits would come, and when they did, Jake would be ready. The stillness of the morning shattered as the thunderous sound of hooves grew closer. It was almost as if the earth itself was trembling, as if the bandits knew that the first sign of weakness was all they needed to make their move. But Jake wasn't about to show weakness. Not now. He stood in the middle of the street, his revolver resting at his side, but his hand never far from the grip. The woman stood beside him, a slight nod from her indicating that she was ready. Their gazes met for just a moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They didn't need words. They knew what they had to do. Behind them, the townspeople were taking up positions, mostly hiding behind the buildings and other cover. A few brave souls were standing in the open, unsure of what to expect, but determined to hold their ground. Jake didn't look back. His focus was on the horizon, on the dust rising in the distance, on the riders who were now almost upon them. A moment later, the first bandit rode into view. His silhouette was dark against the rising sun, his hat pulled low, his posture loose but confident. The other riders followed quickly behind him, their faces hidden beneath the shadows of their wide-brimmed hats. They were coming fast, but Jake didn't flinch. He had faced down men like these before. It wasn't the first time he'd stood in the street with a gun in his hand, but it might very well be the last time he faced a group like this. The leader of the gang raised a hand, signaling the others to slow down. His horse came to a stop a few paces away from Jake, the sound of the hooves fading as the other bandits spread out behind him. "You're making a mistake, Cowboy," the leader said, his voice cold and dripping with arrogance. "You don't belong here. This is our town now." Jake didn't answer immediately. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the leader's face. "This town doesn't belong to you," he said quietly, "and you're not taking it without a fight." The leader chuckled, a low, mocking sound that carried across the street. "A fight, huh? You really think you can take on all of us? 6 men against 1 cowboy?" Jake didn't flinch. "I don't need to take on all of you. Just enough to make sure you know you've lost." The woman shifted slightly beside him, her rifle steady in her hands. Jake could feel the tension building in the air, thick and electric, as if the world was holding its breath. The bandits hadn't made a move yet, but Jake knew that the second they did, everything would change. The leader smirked, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. "We could have taken this town without firing a shot, but you made this personal. You should have stayed out of it. Now, we're gonna make you regret that." With a flick of his hand, the leader signaled to the rest of the bandits. They began to dismount, moving with the quiet precision of men who knew exactly what they were doing. Jake's hand tightened around his revolver, but he didn't draw it yet. He couldn't. Not until they made the first move. The wind kicked up again, dust swirling around them as the bandits spread out, surrounding them. Jake didn't flinch, didn't move a muscle. He was waiting for the right moment. Then, in an instant, it happened. The leader's hand shot to his revolver, and with a speed that was almost too quick to see, Jake's gun was already in his hand, his finger pulling the trigger before the leader could even draw. The shot rang out, loud and sharp in the stillness of the morning, and the leader was thrown back in the saddle, his body jerking as the bullet hit him in the chest. The bandits froze for a split second, stunned by the speed of the shot. It was enough of a distraction for Jake to draw again, sending another bullet into the chest of the man closest to him. The second bandit went down without a sound, his revolver slipping from his hand as he fell backward off his horse. The remaining 4 bandits reacted quickly, reaching for their guns, but they were already too slow. The woman fired her rifle, sending a shot straight through the shoulder of the third bandit, dropping him like a sack of potatoes. Jake moved forward, firing again, hitting another bandit square in the chest. There was no hesitation in his movements, no wasted motion. He had practiced this too many times to let anything get in his way. The remaining 2 bandits, realizing the fight was quickly slipping out of their hands, began to retreat. But Jake wasn't about to let them escape. He fired again, his revolver roaring as the bullet took out the last man's knee, sending him crashing to the ground. The street fell silent. The only sound was the soft whistle of the wind as it swept through the dust. Jake stood in the center of it all, his heart still pounding, but his body calm, the adrenaline beginning to fade. The woman stepped forward, rifle in hand, scanning the fallen bandits. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She moved with the same efficiency as always, checking for any survivors, ensuring that none of the bandits were getting up to cause more trouble. Jake stood still, watching the woman work. He felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. This was it. The fight had come to Red Bluff, and they had fought back. But there was still work to do. "We need to make sure this town is safe," Jake said, his voice steady. "I don't care if they have friends coming. We won't let them take this place." The woman nodded, but there was something in her eyes. A flicker of doubt, maybe. She had seen this kind of thing before. She knew what happened when men like these came to town. "They'll keep coming, Jake," she said softly. "But we can fight. As long as we're standing, we can fight." Jake nodded. She was right. This wasn't over. But for the moment, they had one. The people of Red Bluff were safe, and that's all that mattered. For now, the sound of hooves grew distant as the last remnants of the bandits' group retreated, leaving the street in eerie silence. The adrenaline still burned in Jake's veins, his heart pounding as his eyes swept across the town, taking in the fallen bandits and the battered, yet standing, townsfolk. The fight was over, for now, but the question that hung in the air like a thick fog was whether it was really over at all. Jake Holbrook had spent his life running from trouble, trying to escape the world he had been a part of. But he had known, deep down, that the past never really let a man go. It followed you, shadowing every step, every choice you made, until it cornered you. Red Bluff had become his refuge. But in a world like this, even a refuge didn't last forever. "We're not done," Jake said, his voice low, the calmness of his tone at odds with the fury that still burned inside him. He looked over at the woman, who stood a few paces away, rifle in hand, her eyes scanning the fallen bandits. There was no fear in her stance, only readiness, a certain coldness in the way she held herself. "I know," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "This won't be the last of them." Jake's jaw tightened as he looked at the bodies of the men he had just taken down. Each of them had come into town looking for trouble, looking to take what didn't belong to them, and they had paid the price for their arrogance. But Jake knew the score. There would be more of them. There always were. He turned toward the townspeople, who had started to emerge from behind cover. Some of them were hesitant, their faces pale, others uncertain, but all of them were standing taller now, their backs straighter, as if the very sight of Jake and the woman had given them courage. They had fought for their town, but Jake wasn't under any illusions. This wasn't a victory, it was a temporary reprieve. And even though Red Bluff was standing, its fate had already been sealed. Word would get out. It always did. "We'll need to prepare for more," Jake said to the townsfolk, his voice cutting through the uneasy murmur of the crowd. "They'll be back. And next time, we won't have the element of surprise on our side." A man stepped forward, his hands shaking as he looked around at the carnage. "What can we do? We've never fought like this before. Some of us never even picked up a gun." Jake gave him a long look, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "I know, and you don't have to fight if you don't want to, but we can't afford to wait for them to come knocking. They'll keep coming, looking for a weakness. We need to make sure we have the means to defend ourselves. The woman stepped forward, her eyes scanning the crowd. We'll need supplies, ammunition, food, water. And we'll need to keep watch. Night or day, we can't let our guard down. Jake nodded. Right. We'll need volunteers. Anyone who can handle a gun needs to be on the lookout. The rest of you, stay prepared. If we work together, we can hold our ground. The crowd was quiet, but there was a shift. A sense of resolve began to settle in, like the first wave of a storm rolling in. Some of the ranchers nodded, already stepping forward to offer their help. Jake could feel the shift, the way the people who had been uncertain just moments ago were beginning to steel themselves for the fight ahead. He looked at the woman again, who was already moving to speak with a few of the townsfolk, organizing them into small groups. She was a force of nature, and Jake knew that the town needed her as much as they needed him. Looks like we're going to need some reinforcements, Jake said to her, his voice quieter now that the townspeople were busy preparing. But we can't rely on outside help. We're going to have to hold our ground. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. You're right, but there's a cost to this. There always is. Jake didn't answer. He knew exactly what she meant. The price of survival was steep in a world like this. It wasn't just about guns and ammunition. It was about the toll it took on your soul, on the people you cared about. He had already lost too much in his life. He wasn't about to lose Red Bluff, too. The day passed slowly as Jake and the woman helped the townsfolk gather supplies, set up watch points, and organize into groups for patrols. They worked in silence for the most part, each of them fully aware of what was at stake. Every minute that passed without incident felt like a fragile moment of peace, a brief flicker of hope in the darkness. But Jake knew that it wouldn't last. By nightfall, the town had been fortified as much as possible. The saloon was now the main headquarters, with a few of the more experienced townsfolk keeping watch from the upper floors. Jake stood outside, watching the horizon, his mind never fully at ease. The woman stood beside him, rifle resting against her shoulder, her eyes scanning the landscape. She didn't say anything for a long while, and Jake was content to let the silence stretch between them. He knew there was more on her mind than just the defense of the town, but neither of them was ready to talk about it. We've done what we can for now, she said finally, breaking the silence. But we can't keep this up forever. They'll be back. Jake nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. I know, but we'll be ready. There was a long pause before she spoke again. This town won't be the same after all of this. Even if we win, there'll be a cost. Jake didn't look at her as she spoke. He knew exactly what she meant. It wasn't just about the fight ahead. It was about what came after. The scars that would remain long after the last shot was fired, the toll it would take on the people here. We'll make sure it's worth it, Jake said quietly. We'll make sure they know Red Bluff isn't for taking. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of the desert, the dust, and something more. The promise of the battle that was sure to come. Jake didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. Red Bluff had made its stand. Now, Jake was going to make sure it wasn't a stand that would be forgotten. The night passed slowly, and Jake's eyes never fully left the horizon. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The people of Red Bluff were settled into their positions, but the tension was palpable. Everyone knew what was coming. It wasn't just the bandits. They had learned that lesson long ago. It was the unknown, the creeping uncertainty of what would be left when the dust settled, when the shooting was done, and the bodies were counted. Jake stood at the edge of the town, his boots shifting slightly in the dust, his revolver resting against his thigh. The familiar weight of it was reassuring, but there was something else, a nagging thought, an unease that had settled deep in his chest. What if this time was different? What if the next fight wouldn't be one he could win? The woman stood beside him, her posture relaxed, though Jake could tell she was on edge. She hadn't said much since they fortified the town and set the watch, but Jake knew she was thinking the same thing. This fight wasn't just about survival. It was about the cost, the price they would pay for the chance to keep going. You know they'll be back, she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet certainty that this wasn't going to end soon. Jake didn't answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on the distant hills, the land stretching out before them like a vast, empty canvas. The sky was dark now, the stars dimmed by the lingering dust in the air. The wind had died down, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves and the distant cry of a coyote. "They'll be back," Jake said finally, his voice low but firm. "But we're ready for them." The woman turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze, something that made Jake uneasy, though he didn't know why. They had been through worse, hadn't they? They had survived worse. But this time, the stakes were different. They weren't just fighting for their own lives. They were fighting for the future of Red Bluff, for the people who had put their trust in them. "Ready for them?" she repeated, her voice soft but tinged with doubt. "How ready can we be? Really?" Jake felt the weight of her words like a punch to the gut. She was right. How ready could they really be? The town had done what it could, but they were outnumbered, outgunned. The bandits knew how to fight dirty, and the longer they stayed, the more resources they drained from Red Bluff. The odds weren't in their favor, and as much as Jake hated to admit it, the truth was that they couldn't hold out forever. "We're as ready as we can be," Jake replied, his voice steady. "We'll hold our ground, and when they come, we'll make them regret it." The woman didn't say anything. She just nodded, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the town, looking for any signs of movement. Jake knew she wasn't convinced, and honestly, neither was he. But there was no choice. If they ran, if they gave up, Red Bluff would fall. And Jake had already lost too much to let that happen. They stood there in silence for a long time, the weight of their thoughts pressing down on them like a storm cloud. The rest of the town was quiet now, the sound of hushed conversations and the occasional rustling of boots against the dirt the only noise. But in that quiet, Jake could feel it, the tension, the waiting. It was the calm before the storm. And he knew that, no matter how hard they fought, no matter how much blood was spilled, there was no guarantee that they would come out on top. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jake saw a figure emerging from the darkness. It was one of the townsfolk, an older man, his face lined with worry. He walked with a purpose, his steps quick and determined. When he saw Jake and the woman, he stopped, his hand raised in greeting. "Sheriff," the man called, his voice strained. "There's something you need to see." Jake exchanged a quick look with the woman, and without a word, they both moved toward the man. As they approached, the man's face was grim, his brow furrowed with concern. "What is it?" Jake asked, his voice low. "They're coming," the man said, his voice shaking. "I saw them. A group of riders. They're making their way to the town fast." Jake's heart sank. It was finally happening. The bandits had arrived, and they weren't going to give Red Bluff a chance to breathe. He turned to the woman, his expression hardening. "Get the others," he ordered. "We need to be ready. We can't wait for them to come to us. We're going to meet them halfway." The woman nodded and disappeared into the shadows, moving quickly to rally the townsfolk. Jake stayed where he was, his mind already running through the steps of what needed to be done. There was no time to waste. The fight was coming, and they needed to be prepared. Jake moved back to the saloon, his boots heavy on the ground. The people inside were already awake, their faces filled with fear and uncertainty. But when they saw Jake, they stood a little taller. He didn't need to say anything. They knew what to do. "We're going to hold our ground," Jake said, his voice carrying through the room. "I won't lie to you. This is going to be tough, but we're in this together. We fight as one, or we fall alone." The townsfolk gathered, their faces a mix of fear and determination. Some of them had never fired a gun in their lives, but tonight, they would learn. They didn't have a choice. Jake looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each person, trying to instill some sense of hope in them. He wasn't sure it would be enough, but he had to believe it would be. For their sake. For Red Bluff's sake. As the town prepared, Jake stepped outside again, his revolver still at his side, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. He could feel the weight of the world pressing on him, but he couldn't let it break him. Not now. Not when they were so close to losing everything. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Jake's grip on his revolver tightened. His mind raced as he scanned the horizon, the growing dust cloud signaling that the bandits were closer now. There was no turning back. No more time for planning. It was now or never. The people of Red Bluff had gathered, prepared to stand their ground. But Jake knew, deep down, that they were still afraid. They hadn't been through what he had. They didn't know what it felt like to face an enemy with nothing but your wits and a gun at your side. But they were ready to try. And that was all that mattered. Jake glanced to his left, where the woman was already at the ready. Her rifle was slung over her back, but her hand was on it, prepared to draw if necessary. Her eyes locked with his, and for a brief moment, there was something unspoken between them. Something that told Jake they would face this fight together, no matter the outcome. "Stay sharp," Jake said quietly, his voice low but filled with resolve. "We don't know how many they've got with them. Keep your heads and don't waste shots." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "We fight until the end." Jake's heart pounded as the sound of hooves grew louder. The first of the riders broke through the line of dust, their horses moving fast, their silhouettes becoming clearer with each passing second. There were more of them than Jake had expected. The bandits had brought reinforcements, at least 10 men, maybe more. This wasn't just a small raid anymore. They were here to finish what they'd started. Jake stepped into the street, his boots steady on the dirt, the grip of his revolver tight in his hand. The woman stood a few paces behind him, her rifle ready. The townsfolk took their positions, some crouching behind crates, others hiding in windows, all waiting for the signal. The fight was about to begin. The bandit leader, a tall, scruffy man with a scar across his cheek, led the group. His eyes locked with Jake's as he brought his horse to a stop, his gun already drawn. "You're still standing, huh?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Thought we'd finished you off last time. But you're still here." Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was in the air between them, thick with the promise of violence. "You'll regret this," the bandit leader growled. "This town is ours now." Jake's voice was steady, almost cold. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The leader smirked, raising his gun. "Then let's see if you can stop all of us." The bandits began to dismount, their guns ready, their eyes scanning the street for any sign of weakness. But Jake and the woman were ready. The townsfolk had taken their positions, their nerves steeled for the coming fight. And then, like a signal from the heavens, the gunfire erupted. The woman fired first, the crack of her rifle splitting the air as one of the bandits fell, his chest a dark stain on his shirt. The sound of gunfire was deafening, chaos erupting in an instant as Jake's revolver roared to life. One bandit went down, another fell to the ground. But still, the bandits pressed forward, their shots coming faster, harder. Jake kept his movements calculated, his aim sharp. He knew he couldn't waste time. Each shot had to count. Another bandit dropped as Jake's bullet hit him square in the chest. The leader's men were disorganized, unsure of how to deal with the precision of the gunfighters in Red Bluff. The bandits had underestimated Jake and the woman, and that was their fatal mistake. But they weren't done yet. The bandit leader bellowed a command, and the remaining men charged forward, guns blazing. Jake ducked behind a barrel for cover, his mind racing. The woman took another shot, her rifle ringing out with deadly precision. But there were too many of them now. The town was starting to feel like it was crumbling under the weight of the fight. Jake knew they needed a plan. They needed to break the charge, scatter the bandits, and take them out one by one. But how? A flash of movement caught his eye. The woman had spotted something. She was already on the move. She'd seen a gap in their formation. "Follow me," she shouted. Without hesitation, Jake moved toward her, his feet carrying him fast through the street as they dodged more gunfire. They reached the corner of the saloon, and the woman ducked behind the wooden post, taking cover behind a small cart. Jake followed suit, taking position with her. The woman didn't hesitate, raising her rifle and taking a long, calculated shot. One of the bandits fell. It was a clean shot, but they weren't done yet. Jake could see the leader now, his eyes wild with rage. Jake stood from behind the cart and charged forward, his revolver drawn. The bandit leader took a shot at him, but Jake was already faster. The leader's shot missed by a hair, and Jake's revolver answered with a sharp crack as he fired. The leader was thrown from his horse, his body jerking as the bullet hit him square in the chest. Silence fell over the street for a moment, But Jake knew it wouldn't last. More bandits were coming. More shots rang out, and the battle surged forward again. This time with the remaining bandits realizing the tide was turning. The bandits had lost their leader. They were beginning to falter. One by one, the remaining men began to retreat, unsure if they could keep fighting, unsure if they could win. Jake's heart raced, the gunfire still ringing in his ears, but his mind was clear. He took another step forward, his revolver steady. He wasn't done. He wouldn't be until every last bandit was gone. With a final, coordinated effort, the remaining bandits fled, their retreat messy and panicked. Jake didn't give chase. He didn't need to. The fight was over. As the last of the bandits disappeared into the desert night, Jake stood in the middle of the street, panting, the weight of the moment slowly sinking in. The townsfolk began to emerge from cover, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Red Bluff had survived. The woman walked up to him, her rifle still ready, but her expression softened. "We won," she said quietly. Jake nodded, though his mind was already turning toward the next step. He wasn't going to let his guard down. Not now, not ever again. Red Bluff was safe, for the moment, but he knew that the West never stayed calm for long. "We won," Jake said, his voice steady. "But this isn't over. It never is." If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.